One of the transformative developments in military history was the development of formalized conscription at the national level. Spearheaded by the French during the Revolutionary Wars and subsequent Napoleonic Wars, the practice quickly spread across the industrialized world, although it took until the First World War to become fully entrenched. Only a minor pun intended. In the United States, until 1940, conscription, or the draft, had only been used in wartime, but the Select Service and Training Act instituted a peacetime draft that would remain in place until 1973, when the pressures resulting from Vietnam, among others, resulted in the United States moving to an all-volunteer professional military. I'm your host David, and today we are going to explore the conditions that led to Operation Volar and the impacts and effects it revealed. This is the Cold War. On July 1st, 1973, the American draft appeared to die. No more induction notices landing in mailboxes like government-issued thunderbolts. No more lottery numbers deciding whose life could be interrupted by the state. No more draft boards sorting young men into categories of risk, deferment, obligation, and escape. And after Vietnam, that mattered. The draft had become one of the most hated symbols of the war. It was not just a mechanism for filling the ranks of the military, it was a public wound. It exposed class inequality, racial inequality, educational privilege, political distrust, and the brutal fact that the burdens of war were not shared equally. For many Americans, the draft was Vietnam made bureaucratic, a system of forms, categories, and orders that could turn an 18-year-old into military manpower. So, when active draft inductions ended in 1973, it looked like a clean break. But the draft didn't really die, it just changed form. The Army moved towards an all-volunteer force, and Project Volar, that is Volunteer Army, tried to make military service attractive enough that enough people would choose it. Selective service stayed in the background, waiting for the next emergency, and when the Cold War heated up again after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, draft registration came back. Then, the debate took a turn that revealed something deeper. If citizenship meant obligation, what about women? That question would haunt the draft, the Equal Rights Amendment, and the politics of American equality for decades because the United States did not so much abolish the draft after Vietnam as place it in a glass case labeled "break in case of World War III." But to understand why this came about, we have to start with the way Vietnam broke the draft. The United States had used conscription before Vietnam, of course. The modern selective service system came out of a 20th century world shaped by global war, military planning, and the assumption that a modern state needed the capacity to mobilize bodies quickly. During the Cold War, that assumption became even stronger. The United States was no longer thinking of mobilization as something that happened only after a declared war. It was living inside a permanent national security emergency where if war broke out, there would be no time to induct men and train them before sending them off to fight the nation's wars. The Cold War demanded readiness, and readiness, at least in the eyes of policymakers, required access to manpower. But by the late 1960s, the draft had become politically explosive. Vietnam didn't create everyday problems with conscription, but it made those problems impossible to ignore. The war revealed how unevenly the state distributed sacrifice. College deferments protected many middle-class men. Working-class men had fewer exit ramps. Men with resources, legal help, medical documentation, or educational access could often navigate the system more effectively than those without them and escape service. The draft lottery, introduced as a reform in 1969, was supposed to make the system feel fairer, but it couldn't erase the larger question hanging over the war. Why were young men being forced to fight in a conflict that more and more Americans believed was immoral, unwinnable, or both? Anti-war activism made the draft a central battlefield between citizens and the state. Draft cards were burned, induction centers became protest sites, and many young men fled, resisted, complied, agonized, or tried to find any legal category that would keep them out. Families were divided over it, campuses erupted over it, politicians argued. The draft had become a crisis of legitimacy, and that was the key problem. It was not only that the military needed people, it was that the method for getting those people had become corrosive. Every draft call risked reminding the public of Vietnam's inequalities and failures. For Richard Nixon, ending the draft became politically useful. It allowed him to speak to anti-war frustration without necessarily abandoning American military power. An all-volunteer force promised to remove the most visible point of contact between ordinary citizens and the war machine. If people chose to enlist, then military manpower could be framed as a labor market rather than coercion. And that was the distinction that mattered. Ending the active draft could reduce anti-war mobilization. It could make military service seem less like state compulsion and more like individual choice. It could help preserve American military flexibility without forcing every major deployment to drag the entire country back through the trauma of conscription. But policymakers were not ready to abandon the draft completely. The Gates Commission, formerly the President's Commission on an All-Volunteer Armed Force, recommended moving toward a volunteer military. But the idea was not simply no draft ever again. The all-volunteer force was imagined alongside the continued possibility of a standby draft. In other words, the United States would stop routinely forcing people into uniform, but it would keep the capacity to do so if an emergency required it. But that created a practical problem. If the Army could no longer rely on conscripts, it had to become something it had not really needed to be before: attractive. And that is where Project Volar enters the story. Volar stood for Volunteer Army. It was the Army's experimental bridge between the draft-era military and the all-volunteer force. It was not the law that ended conscription. It was the Army's attempt to answer a brutally practical question: what would make people enlist, and what would make them stay if they technically had the option to leave? The answer, it turned out, was not simply more patriotic posters and louder marching bands. Shocking, I know. Project Volar began in the early 1970s as the Army tried to prepare for a future without the draft. Experiments took place at major installations, including Fort Benning, Fort Carson, Fort Ord, and others. The project tested ways to improve the daily lives of soldiers and make military service feel less arbitrary, less miserable, and less trapped in the habits of the conscription era. This was the Army discovering, mostly against their will, that soldiers were human beings with preferences. Some of the reforms sound basic. That's because they were basic. Better barracks, more privacy, less pointless make work, more predictable schedules, more reasonable pass policies, fewer petty humiliations, civilian workers replacing soldiers for some menial duties, including KP, kitchen police, experiments with a 5-day work week, more attention to job satisfaction, professionalism, and morale. Behind all of this was a cultural shift. A conscript army can survive a certain amount of misery because the people inside it have limited exit options. A volunteer army has to care whether people want to join, more importantly, whether they want to re-enlist, and most importantly, whether they tell everyone back home if the army is a decent career or a soul-crushing work camp in camouflage. That meant the army had to think differently. Recruitment mattered, retention mattered, pay mattered, benefits mattered, family life mattered. Living conditions absolutely mattered. The daily texture of military life mattered. The old assumption that obedience could substitute for morale no longer worked. Project Volar was not a clean miracle. Its results were mixed. Different bases implemented reforms differently. Some commanders embraced the changes more than others. Some reforms were difficult to measure, and no quality of life program could magically erase the larger problems facing the Army at the end of Vietnam: drug use, racial tension, discipline problems, low morale, public hostility, and the fact that many Americans associated military service with a failed war. But Volar mattered because it signaled an institutional transformation. The Army could not simply remove the draft, print a recruitment brochure, and expect volunteers to appear. It had to build a military labor market. It had to learn how to sell service. It had to compete for young people's time, bodies, and futures. And that meant that it was not just a manpower policy, but was part of a political strategy. The United States wanted a military that could remain globally active without provoking the kind of mass domestic resistance that Vietnam had produced. The all-volunteer force helped make that possible. Military service became concentrated among those who chose it, or those for whom enlistment seemed like the best available economic option. The rest of the public could support, ignore, praise, or debate the military without facing the same immediate personal risk of being drafted. The draft had been a blunt instrument. Volar helped build something more subtle. But even as the Army learned to recruit volunteers, Washington refused to throw away the old draft machine. Active inductions ended in 1973, but the selective service system remained. The legal administrative framework survived. The United States had stopped calling men up, but it had not abandoned the idea that it might call them up later. And that distinction is the heart of the story. Although in 1975, President Gerald Ford suspended active registration, making the draft feel even more dead. But again, the state had not renounced the power of conscription. It had merely let parts of the system go quiet. Then came 1979. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan shocked Washington and intensified Cold War fears. Suddenly, questions of readiness, resolve, and mobilization returned with new urgency. President Jimmy Carter responded in part by restoring draft registration in 1980. Registration was not conscription, but instead it was more like conscription's shadow. It created a database of eligible men, which would shorten the time needed to mobilize in case of a crisis. It signaled national preparedness and preserved the idea that the state could claim military labor in an emergency. The government was not drafting people, but it was making sure it knew where to find them. And that's where the draft's afterlife becomes unmistakably Cold War. Vietnam had made the draft politically radioactive, but Afghanistan made registration politically useful again. The United States wanted to prove it remained prepared for confrontation with the Soviet Union, but it didn't want to rekindle the full social crisis of conscription. Registration offered a middle ground: symbolic toughness, administrative readiness, and just enough distance from the actual draft to avoid immediate political combustion. But Carter also supported registering women, and that proposal opened a much larger fight. Congress refused to include women in the draft registration. The result was a male-only system, challenged in court and ultimately upheld by the Supreme Court in Rostker v. Goldberg in 1981. The court's reasoning depended heavily on the military structure of the time. Women were then excluded from combat roles by law or policy. Since Congress understood draft registration as preparation for a possible draft of combat troops, the court accepted Congress's decision to register men and not women. Men and women, the court held, were not similarly situated for the purposes of draft registration because women were barred from combat. And to be fair, that ruling made sense within the formal military rules of 1981. But it also carried a timer inside it. If the justification for male-only registration depended on women's exclusion from combat, then any future expansion of women's military roles would weaken the logic underneath the system. And even before that logic began to wobble, the idea of women in the draft had already become a political weapon, which brings us to the Equal Rights Amendment. The ERA proposed constitutional equality regardless of sex. Supporters saw it as a basic guarantee of equal citizenship. Opponents framed it as a threat to the social order, and one of their most effective arguments was simple, vivid, and frightening. If women had equal rights, women could be drafted. The argument became central to anti-ERA organizing. Phyllis Schlafly and Stop ERA understood the power of making equality sound dangerous. Equal rights could seem abstract. Constitutional language could feel distant, but your daughter drafted into combat was immediate. It moved the debate from legal principle to kitchen table fear. So this was not only about military policy, but also about gender ideology. Anti-ERA activists argued that women's exemption from the draft was a form of protection, but that language of protection carried a whole social order inside it. Women were to be protected because women were different. Women were domestic. Women were mothers or future mothers, which meant they belonged to the family, not the battlefield. Men bore the obligations of combat because men were imagined as the public citizens, the defenders, the ones whose bodies belonged to the state in wartime. In that framework, excluding women from the draft could be presented as a privilege. But it was also a boundary. Feminists did not all answer the draft question in the same way. Some argued that equal citizenship might require equal obligations if the draft existed. Others, especially anti-war feminists, opposed the draft altogether and argued that equality should not mean equal access to militarism. But both positions challenged the anti-ERA claim that exclusion was the same thing as freedom, because being spared an obligation can look like a privilege until you notice that the same logic is being used to deny full citizenship. The fight over women in the draft was never only about whether women would be sent to war. It was about whether equality meant entering institutions built by men. It was about whether the state could claim women as citizens in the same way it claimed men. It was about whether protection was a legal benefit or a political leash. And it was very much a Cold War argument. The Cold War United States often treated the nuclear family as a symbol of national stability. Domestic order was not just private, it was ideological. The housewife, the breadwinner, the children, the suburban home, the protected mother. These were part of how America imagined itself against communism. So, the idea of women being drafted threatened more than military policy. It threatened the symbolic architecture of gendered citizenship. Anti-ERA activists knew that. They used the draft as a panic button, and it worked. The ERA failed to achieve ratification by its original deadline. The reasons were many, but fear of women's conscription became one of the most emotionally powerful tools in the opposition campaign. It turned equality into vulnerability. It turned citizenship into danger. It turned the military into proof that women needed special legal treatment, even when that special treatment reinforced their inequality. And meanwhile, well, the selective service continued. The United States did not restart the draft. The all-volunteer force became normal. Generations grew up with registration as a background obligation for men, a form signed or ignored, a requirement tied to federal benefits, student aid, and the quiet possibility of future mobilization. But the issue never fully went away. As women's roles in the military expanded, the old logic of male-only registration became harder to defend. Women served in more capacities, deployed in more conflicts, and became increasingly central to the functioning of the all-volunteer force. By the 2010s, formal combat exclusions had been dismantled. Once women could serve in combat roles, the 1981 rationale for excluding them from registration became much less stable, and the question returned: if military service is a civic obligation, why is the obligation sex-specific? There are different answers to that question. Some argue that registration should include women. Others argue that the better solution is to abolish selective service entirely. But either way, the contradiction remains. The United States built an all-volunteer force while preserving a standby system of coercion. It ended active conscription while maintaining the legal imagination of a future draft. It told citizens that service was voluntary while keeping a list in case volunteerism wasn't enough. And that is the draft's afterlife. Project Volar built the volunteer army. Selective service preserved the emergency draft. The ERA fight exposed the gender politics underneath the whole system. After Vietnam, America wanted to believe that it had buried the draft, but we all know that the Cold War institutions are rarely buried cleanly. They're archived, renamed and revised, and kept close enough to reach for in a crisis. The draft became less visible, but not less meaningful. It moved from induction centers into registration databases, from daily military manpower into emergency planning, from anti-war protests into constitutional debate, from the question who will fight in Vietnam into the question who counts as a full citizen when the state comes calling. That is why the story of the draft after Vietnam is not just a story about military policy. It's a story about the Cold War state trying to preserve readiness without reigniting rebellion. It's a story about the army learning to market itself by being all that you can be, or getting more done by 6 a.m. than most people get done in a day. It's a story about women's equality being turned into a threat. And it's a story about how institutions survive by changing shape. The all-volunteer force did not replace the draft completely. It layered recruitment on top of standby coercion. And the debate over women and registration revealed the deeper question that never really disappeared. In a democracy, who owes what to the state and who gets to decide? The draft did not die after Vietnam, it just learned to wait. We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and to make sure you don't miss our future work, please make sure you're subscribed to our channel and have pressed the bell button, which has failed to get a college or medical deferment and is now hoofing it to Canada. Please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/thecoldwar or through YouTube membership. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com. This is the Cold War Channel, and as we think about the Cold War, please remember that history is shades of gray and rarely black and white.